The smell of sizzling ribs and smoked brisket filled the air as I stood by my grill, flipping burgers and laughing with my neighbors. It was a perfect Saturday afternoon, kids running around, cold drinks in hand, and the kind of warmth that only a backyard barbecue could bring. My wife, Elise, had set up a long table with sides and desserts, and the music played just loud enough to keep the energy up. Then, like a dark cloud rolling in to ruin a summer day, she arrived. Karren Delacroix, the HOA president from hell, marched straight into my backyard without so much as a knock. Her short blonde bob bounced with every aggressive step, her face twisted into that signature scowl. She clutched a clipboard like it was a weapon, her eyes darting around as if she were tallying up imaginary violations. "Frederick Emerson," she barked, her voice cutting through the music. "This gathering is unauthorized." I sighed, setting down my spatula. "Karren, it's a barbecue. In my own backyard. On my property." She sniffed, glancing at the food spread like it personally offended her. "There's a noise ordinance, Frederick. You didn't submit an event request to the HOA board for approval." I folded my arms. "I don't need approval to have friends over." Karren's lips curled into a self-satisfied grin. "Actually, per Section 17, subsection B of the HOA guidelines, any gathering exceeding 10 people requires board approval. And I don't recall receiving a request from you." I clenched my jaw. "That's ridiculous." She pulled out her phone. "Then I suppose you won't mind if I call the non-emergency line and report this violation?" Elise stepped forward, arms crossed. "Karren, this is a family barbecue. The music isn't even that loud." Karren ignored her completely, tapping away on her screen. "Rules are rules. You should have thought about that before disturbing the community." Within 15 minutes, a security guard hired by the HOA, some bored guy in his 20s, showed up. "Sorry, man," he said with an apologetic shrug. "Karren said I have to shut this down." I looked around at my guests, all watching with frustration and disbelief. The kids were confused. The adults were muttering angrily. But I knew how this worked. If I pushed back too hard, Karren would slap me with a fine, or worse, try to escalate things to the county. Grinding my teeth, I turned off the music and gave my guests an apologetic nod. "Guess that's it, folks." Karren beamed. "Glad to see you're finally respecting the rules, Frederick." As she strutted away, I watched her go, rage simmering in my chest. She had embarrassed me, ruined a great afternoon, and shown once again that she wielded HOA rules like a personal vendetta. But as she disappeared down the street, something caught my eye, a flyer taped to a lamppost. HOA Annual Gala Saturday Night, hosted by Karren Delacroix. A slow, calculated grin spread across my face. Karren had just messed with the wrong homeowner, and I was about to return the favor. The moment I saw that flyer, an idea took root, something so satisfying that I had to stop myself from grinning right there in the street. Karren had shut down my harmless backyard barbecue with her petty HOA rules. But now she was hosting an extravagant gala? I knew for a fact she hadn't gotten approval from the entire community. Oh no, this event was purely for her and her little HOA cronies. I walked back to my house, already running through my options. Elise met me at the back door, her expression still tight with frustration. She set down a tray of leftover food, shaking her head. "She really couldn't just leave us alone for one afternoon?" she muttered. I sat down across from her, my mind already working out the details. "She thinks she's untouchable," I said. "That's the problem." Elise raised a brow, picking up on my tone. "And you're planning something, aren't you?" I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. "Karren's event? I guarantee she didn't follow the same rules she just threw at us. And I know exactly how to make sure her night doesn't go the way she's expecting." Elise's lips twitched. "I like where this is going." I spent the next few days digging. Every HOA rulebook I could get my hands on, every local ordinance, every approval process the board was supposed to follow. Karren had shut down my barbecue over noise ordinances and event approvals, but her gala was being held in the neighborhood clubhouse, a facility that, according to HOA bylaws, required a unanimous vote to be used for private events. She hadn't put it up for a vote. Even better, the event was being powered by the HOA's main electrical system, the same one that was technically managed by the utility company, but had an emergency shutoff located in a locked panel on the clubhouse property. A shutoff that, per regulations, could only be accessed under specific circumstances. Circumstances I now had the perfect justification for. The night of the gala arrived and the neighborhood transformed. Expensive cars lined the streets, their glossy exteriors reflecting the glow of the string lights Karren had draped over the clubhouse entrance. Music poured from the building, loud enough that I could hear it from my front porch. So much for noise ordinances. Elise stood beside me, arms crossed. She really went all out, she mused, watching as servers carried trays of champagne flutes into the building. She always does, I muttered. Always using HOA funds for her personal kingdom. Elise nudged me. Time for your plan? I checked my watch. Right on schedule. I made my way down the street, blending in with the small groups of residents gathering near the entrance. Some had been invited, others, like me, were just watching. I spotted Karren near the doors, wearing an elegant black dress, basking in the admiration of her loyal followers. I didn't bother approaching her. I had more important things to do. Circling around to the back of the clubhouse, I reached the maintenance panel. It was secured with a key padlock, but here's the thing: HOA board members were predictable. They always used the same combination for everything. And since Karren was the type who never imagined anyone would challenge her, she hadn't bothered changing it. I punched in the code and the panel clicked open. Inside, the main electrical shutoff gleamed under the dim light. I pulled out my phone, ready to document everything. I wasn't just cutting the power, I was ensuring that when Karren tried to fight back, I had the legal justification to prove she had violated her own rules. I flipped the switch. Instantly, the entire gala plunged into darkness. The music died, voices turned to confused murmurs, and then the shouting began. I stepped back, making my way around the side of the building just in time to see Karren storming out, her expression a mask of disbelief and fury. What happened to the lights? She snapped at one of the servers. He stammered, holding a useless flashlight. I don't know. Everything just went out. A few guests pulled out their phones, casting eerie glows across the now ruined event. The carefully arranged decorations were useless in the dark, the expensive catering wasted as people stumbled around. I strolled forward, keeping my expression neutral. Looks like a power failure, I said casually. Strange, considering the clubhouse is supposed to be on a priority grid. Karren turned, her eyes narrowing when she saw me. You, she hissed. What did you do? I shrugged. Nothing. But you did. She blinked. What are you talking about? I pulled out my phone, displaying the HOA rulebook I had saved. According to Section 23, subsection A, private events in community buildings require a vote. You never held one. That means this isn't a sanctioned event, and per the bylaws, unauthorized use of HOA resources including power can be subject to immediate shutdown. Her face twisted. That's not. I held up a second document. And per county records, the emergency shutoff can be activated in any situation where an unauthorized event is taking place. The crowd around us had gone silent, listening intently. Some of the residents started murmuring amongst themselves, realizing what I was saying. Karren's mouth opened and closed, her usual commanding presence crumbling as she realized she had no comeback. I leaned in slightly. You shut down my barbecue over rules, Karren. Well, I just made sure you followed them too. And just like that, the mighty queen of the HOA had been dethroned. The stunned silence hung in the air, stretching just long enough for the full weight of what had happened to sink in. The elegant gala, carefully orchestrated to stroke Karren's ego, lay in ruins. Guests murmured in discontent, casting judgmental glances at the HOA president, who had just been exposed for her blatant rule-breaking. Some fumbled with their phones, the dim glow of their screens barely illuminating their faces. Others wandered toward the exits, knowing the night was effectively over. Karren's expression wavered between disbelief and anger, her carefully maintained composure cracking under the pressure. Her fingers twitched at her sides, as if itching to snatch back control of the situation. But there was nothing left to salvage. Still, she wasn't one to walk away without a fight. She spun toward one of the HOA board members, a balding man in a stiff suit who had been following her around all night like an obedient lapdog. With barely restrained fury, she demanded answers, but the man merely stammered, clearly unwilling to get involved in a losing battle. The other board members weren't faring much better. One woman, a high-ranking member of Karren's inner circle, had taken a cautious step away, as if physically distancing herself from the disaster might spare her from the fallout. Another man, whose loyalties seemed to waver depending on the situation, ran a hand through his graying hair and muttered something about needing to review the bylaws. I didn't wait for them to sort out their internal chaos. I had done what I came to do, and the rest would unravel naturally. Turning on my heel, I walked away, leaving Karren to deal with the consequences of her own hypocrisy. Elise was already waiting for me near the street, her arms casually folded over her chest, watching the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. As I reached her, she tilted her head slightly. She took that about as well as I expected, she mused. I exhaled, shaking my head. She's scrambling, but the damage is done. Elise's lips twitched with amusement. So, what now? She's not exactly the type to let this go. I knew that much. Karren wasn't just going to accept defeat and fade into the background. She had built her entire identity around controlling the HOA, and a public embarrassment like this would only make her more desperate to reassert her authority. And that meant she was going to retaliate. I wasn't the only one who realized it. Over the next few days, word of the gala disaster spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had once been too intimidated to speak out now openly criticized Karren's leadership. They questioned where the HOA funds had gone, why she was allowed to bend the rules to suit her own needs, and whether she had overstepped her authority one too many times. For once, people weren't just grumbling in private. They were organizing. I received a call from a neighbor, a retired attorney named Leonard, who had been quietly watching the HOA's antics for years. He had stacks of documents proving financial mismanagement and was more than willing to help build a case against Karren. Another neighbor, a younger woman named Diana, took it upon herself to start a petition to remove Karren from her position. She went door to door, gathering signatures from frustrated homeowners who had been waiting for an opportunity to push back against the HOA's overreach. Elise and I hosted a small gathering, this time indoors, just to avoid giving Karren another excuse to interfere. The turnout was larger than expected. People wanted change, and for the first time, they believed it was possible. But Karren wasn't going down without a fight. She started issuing fines left and right, targeting anyone who had been involved in the petition. Lawn too long? Fine. Trash can left out for an extra hour? Fine. A decorative flag that wasn't HOA approved? Another fine. It was blatant retaliation, and everyone saw it for what it was. I received my own notice in the mail, a hefty fine for tampering with HOA property. She was trying to pin the power shutdown on me, conveniently ignoring that I had followed the exact procedures outlined in the bylaws. I didn't take the bait. Instead, I filed a formal complaint with the county, attaching every relevant document I had, along with witness statements from neighbors who had seen the gala unfold firsthand. And then the real blow came. Leonard, the retired attorney, had been doing his own digging. One evening, he called me over to his house, a thick folder sitting on the coffee table. Inside were financial records, statements, invoices, and budget reports that painted a damning picture. Karren had been misallocating HOA funds for years. Lavish events, unnecessary security hires, and even personal expenses disguised as community improvements. This wasn't just about petty fines anymore. This was fraud. The next HOA meeting was packed. Residents who had never attended before showed up in droves, eager to see what would happen. Karren sat at the head of the table, her usual smug confidence replaced with barely concealed anxiety. She knew something was coming, but she didn't know how bad it would be. Leonard stood, clearing his throat before addressing the room. He laid out the evidence piece by piece, methodically explaining every misused dollar, every suspicious transaction, every instance where Karren had abused her position for personal gain. The silence in the room was deafening. Karren's face drained of color as she stammered out weak excuses, but no one was buying it. The petition to remove her had already gathered enough signatures. The vote was unanimous. She was out. And as she stormed out of the meeting, humiliated and powerless, I leaned back in my chair, satisfied that justice had finally been served. The neighborhood was ours again. With Karren officially ousted, the HOA was in chaos. The remaining board members scrambled to distance themselves from her, claiming they had no idea about the financial mismanagement. Some resigned immediately, while others tried to save face by calling for an emergency election. Leonard took charge of the legal side, making sure every document was filed properly. He also worked with a few neighbors to ensure the county reviewed the HOA's finances. There was a very real chance Karren would face criminal charges. Elise and I watched as our once oppressive HOA crumbled. The tension that had ruled the neighborhood for years was finally lifting. People started openly discussing changes they wanted, things like rolling back unnecessary restrictions, making financial records public, and preventing another power-hungry leader from taking over. Despite her removal, Karren wasn't done causing trouble. She still lived in the neighborhood, though she kept a much lower profile. She avoided most people, but there were rumors that she was trying to find a way to challenge the vote. One afternoon, I was working in my garage when Elise walked up with her phone in hand. She had a look that I recognized, something between amusement and disbelief. She told me that Karren had been spotted going door to door, trying to convince people that the vote to remove her was invalid. Apparently, she was claiming that the petition had been tampered with and that she was still the rightful president. I wasn't surprised. Karren had never been the type to accept defeat. Later that evening, a few neighbors gathered in our backyard to talk about what to do next. The consensus was clear: no one wanted Karren to have any influence over the HOA ever again. Leonard assured us that there was no legal way for her to overturn the vote, but that didn't mean she wouldn't try to stir up trouble. As if on cue, a black SUV rolled down the street and parked in front of Karren's house. A man in a suit stepped out carrying a briefcase. He walked up to Karren's door and knocked. Elise and I exchanged glances. A lawyer. It wasn't long before we found out Karren had hired legal representation. She was attempting to sue the HOA for wrongful removal, claiming that the vote had been orchestrated as a personal attack. She argued that the financial discrepancies were misunderstandings and that she had been unfairly targeted. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the community. Some people were worried that if she won, she'd be reinstated. Others were furious that she was still trying to hold on to power even after everything that had been exposed. Leonard wasn't concerned. He had anticipated something like this and had already prepared a counter-strategy. He called a meeting at the clubhouse, inviting every homeowner who wanted to see Karren gone for good. At the meeting, Leonard explained that Karren's lawsuit had no real foundation. The HOA had followed all legal procedures during the vote, and there was overwhelming evidence of financial misconduct. However, legal battles could drag on, and Karren was banking on that, hoping that people would get tired of fighting and let her back in. He proposed a plan, a formal audit of the HOA's finances conducted by an independent firm. If anything illegal was found, it would go straight to the authorities. That would put an end to Karren's lawsuit before it even gained traction. The motion passed unanimously. A week later, the auditors arrived. They combed through years of records, tracing every suspicious transaction. What they found was worse than anyone had expected. Karren hadn't just misused funds for personal events, she had been funneling money into a private account. Thousands of dollars meant for community upkeep had vanished. The findings were sent to the county, and within days, authorities were involved. 2 officers arrived at Karren's house early one morning. Several neighbors, myself included, watched from a distance as they knocked on her door. She answered, looking disheveled, and within minutes, they were escorting her outside. She tried to argue, gesturing wildly, but the officers remained unfazed. They placed her in the back of the squad car and drove off. The neighborhood was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, people started talking, murmurs of relief, disbelief, and satisfaction. Karren was finally gone. With her out of the picture, the HOA underwent a complete transformation. A new board was elected, made up of residents who actually cared about the community. They focused on transparency, ensuring that homeowners had a say in every decision. The absurd rules Karren had enforced were either rewritten or removed entirely. People could finally enjoy their homes without fear of arbitrary fines. One evening, Elise and I stood in our backyard, grilling burgers while the scent of slow-cooked ribs filled the air. Friends and neighbors laughed, kids played, and music played at a comfortable volume. No one interrupted. No one threatened to shut us down. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like home again. With Karren out of the picture, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. The HOA, once a source of constant frustration, was now led by a group of homeowners who genuinely wanted to improve the community rather than control it. The ridiculous fines and arbitrary rules vanished almost overnight, replaced with policies that made sense for everyone. But just because Karren was gone didn't mean things were completely smooth sailing. The fallout from her reign lingered, and it was going to take time to undo the damage she had caused. One of the biggest issues was the financial mess she had left behind. The auditors had uncovered years of mismanagement, and while much of it had been funneled into her personal account, there were still gaps that needed to be addressed. The HOA had spent money on unnecessary security contracts, overpriced maintenance deals, and questionable beautification projects that had mysteriously never been completed. Leonard, ever the diligent attorney, was working with the newly elected board to ensure that Karren's fraudulent expenses were rectified. He had already filed several legal claims to recover the stolen funds. But even with the evidence stacked against her, the process was slow. Meanwhile, the community itself was undergoing a transformation. Without Karren's oppressive presence looming over every decision, people felt empowered to actually enjoy their homes again. Neighbors who had once been wary of each other due to HOA tensions were now coming together, rebuilding a sense of camaraderie that had been missing for years. One afternoon, I was out in front of my house, repairing a section of my fence that had been neglected for too long. The sound of hammers and saws echoed from several homes on the block as other residents took advantage of the newfound freedom to make renovations without fear of arbitrary fines. Elise stepped outside, shielding her eyes against the sun as she surveyed the work I had done. She had spent the morning talking with some of the other homeowners about an idea that had been gaining traction. A community improvement project where everyone pitched in to restore some of the neglected areas of the neighborhood. She had already rounded up a handful of volunteers to start with the park at the center of the subdivision. Under Karren's rule, it had become little more than an overgrown lot with broken benches and a rusting playground. Now, people were eager to bring it back to life. I wasn't the only one making changes. Across the street, Diana was repainting her front door a bold shade of blue, something that would have been an immediate violation under the old HOA regime. Further down the block, a retired couple was installing a small vegetable garden in their front yard, something Karren had once deemed unsightly. It was small things like this that really drove home how much had changed. That evening, a group of us gathered on Leonard's patio to discuss the next steps for the HOA. The new board members were eager to implement policies that reflected what the community actually wanted rather than what one person dictated. There was talk of revising the budget to ensure that funds were used for actual improvements rather than wasted on unnecessary expenses. Leonard laid out the legal strategy for recovering the stolen money. While Karren was facing criminal charges, there was no guarantee that the funds could be returned quickly. In the meantime, the HOA had to be careful about how it managed its remaining resources. A few homeowners suggested hosting a fundraiser to help cover some of the costs, but the overwhelming consensus was that people had paid enough under Karren's rule. Instead, volunteers stepped up to handle things like basic landscaping and small repairs, ensuring that the neighborhood remained in good condition without draining the budget. As the meeting wrapped up, Leonard mentioned that he had received a curious email from Karren's lawyer. Apparently, she was still trying to fight the charges against her, claiming that she had been set up by a group of disgruntled homeowners. No one was particularly surprised. But what did raise eyebrows was the news that Karren had been attempting to sell her house. Word had spread that she was eager to leave the neighborhood as soon as possible, likely hoping to escape the consequences of her actions. The problem? No one was interested in buying. Her reputation had spread beyond the community, and prospective buyers were wary of getting involved with a property that had been at the center of so much controversy. Real estate agents had already distanced themselves, unwilling to deal with the baggage attached to her name. It was a fitting end in a way. For years, she had used her position to make life miserable for others, controlling every aspect of the neighborhood to suit her own desires. Now, she was trapped in the very place she had sought to dominate, with no allies left to support her. As I walked home that night, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in such a short time. It hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead. But for the first time in years, the neighborhood truly felt like a community again. And no matter what Karren tried next, we were ready. Karren's downfall had been swift, but the aftershocks of her reign still lingered. The neighborhood, while free from her grip, was still adjusting to life without her constant interference. The new HOA board was working hard to rebuild trust, and for the first time in years, people actually felt like they had a voice in their own community. But there was still one unresolved issue: Karren herself. Despite her desperate attempts to sell her house, she remained stuck in a place she had once ruled with an iron fist. The criminal charges against her were moving through the legal system, and though she hadn't been officially convicted, the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Her once pristine front yard was now neglected, the flower beds overgrown, the lawn patchy. The house, which had once been the shining example of her excessive HOA standards, now stood as a reminder of her downfall. No one saw much of her anymore. She stayed inside, her curtains always drawn. The few times she did step out, she avoided eye contact with the neighbors she had once terrorized. It was a strange sight. Karren, the woman who had once strutted through the streets like she owned them, now reduced to a ghost in her own home. One evening, as Elise and I sat on our porch watching the sunset, Leonard stopped by. He had just come from a meeting with the HOA board and had some news. The auditors had finished their final review of the financial records, and the numbers were worse than expected. Karren had drained the HOA's emergency funds almost entirely. There was no immediate financial crisis, but it meant that repairs and improvements would have to be delayed until legal action recovered the stolen money. The board had already taken steps to ensure transparency moving forward. Monthly financial reports would be posted publicly, and no single person would have unchecked access to the funds ever again. But there was something else. Leonard revealed that Karren had made one last desperate move. She had filed a counterclaim against the HOA, accusing them of unlawful removal and defamation. It was a weak attempt to regain control, but it was still a legal matter that had to be addressed. The board wasn't worried. They had all the documentation they needed to prove that everything had been done by the book. But it was clear that Karren wasn't going to go down quietly. A week later, the case was dismissed. The judge didn't even entertain her arguments, citing the overwhelming evidence against her. It was the final nail in the coffin. After that, Karren disappeared entirely. One morning, a moving truck arrived in front of her house. A few workers hauled out furniture, but Karren herself was nowhere to be seen. Some neighbors watched from their porches, whispering amongst themselves. No one knew where she was going, and no one really cared. By the afternoon, the truck was gone and the house stood empty. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt truly at peace. Without Karren's interference, people started making changes. The park renovation project Elise had been organizing was finally happening. Volunteers came together to repaint the playground, install new benches, and plant fresh flowers. The HOA, now focused on actual improvement rather than control, supported the effort by reallocating what little funds they had left. The community came alive in a way it hadn't before. Block parties became a regular occurrence, free from the looming threat of ridiculous fines. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves out of fear of HOA retaliation now openly participated in events. One evening, as Elise and I sat in our backyard, grilling steaks and enjoying the warm breeze, we reflected on everything that had happened. Karren had been a force of chaos, but in the end, she had been her own undoing. Her thirst for power had blinded her to the fact that a community isn't meant to be ruled, it's meant to be lived in. The neighborhood had survived her, and now it was thriving. And as the smell of sizzling meat filled the air, laughter echoing from nearby yards, I knew one thing for certain: this time, there was no one left to shut us down.